In the Pistis Sophia, one of the most controversial Gnostic texts ever discovered, there's a moment the church never wanted you to find. Jesus, after the resurrection, is teaching Mary Magdalene directly. Not the crowds, not the 12 as a group, her. And what he teaches her isn't a parable. It's an activation, a way to wake up something this text calls a vesture of light, what I'm going to call, throughout this video, the body of light. I want to say that again slower, because it deserves to land. After he rises from the dead, Jesus doesn't ascend right away and disappear into the sky like you were taught in Sunday school. The Pistis Sophia says he stays. He teaches. And the deepest layer of what he taught wasn't preached from a hillside. It was given quietly to the one person this text says understood him better than anyone else in the room. That's where I want to take you today. Not into theology. Into the part of the story that got quietly left out, folded away, and eventually forgotten by almost everyone except the people determined enough to go looking for it. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you're going to look at the resurrection completely differently. You might even look at yourself differently. And before we're done, I'm going to walk you through the actual step-by-step activation process this teaching pointed toward, the same one handed down in that room. So don't leave early. That part is still ahead, and it's the part you really came for. Picture the moment the Pistis Sophia describes. It's after the resurrection, not the version you've heard 1,000 times in a Sunday service. He appeared, then he left. This is quieter than that, smaller. A handful of people are gathered, away from the noise of the city, away from anyone who might report back to the authorities, who wanted this whole movement buried along with its founder. And then Jesus is there, not walking in through a door, not looking like the man they buried 3 days before. He's there, and the room fills with light, not the soft light of a lamp, but something closer to standing too near the sun. The kind of light you can't hold your eyes on. He has to bring it down, soften it, just so the people in that room can stay standing. Imagine that for a moment. A man they knew, a man they'd eaten with, walked with, watched suffer, now standing in front of them radiating something none of their eyes were built to hold without flinching. Among them is Mary Magdalene, watching this unfold, her attention locked in a way the others isn't quite. The Pistis Sophia names her as the one who understood him more deeply than anyone else in that room, the one who kept asking, kept pressing, kept wanting to go one layer further than the rest were ready for. Peter is there too, and his mother Mary, and a small circle of others who had earned something the crowds outside never got the chance to earn: nearness. I want you to sit with that image for a second. Not the theology of it, just the moment. A room, a group of people who loved him, and a light coming off his body that none of them had ever seen before, on him or on anyone else. Here's what I keep coming back to. Why here? Why now? If this was the truth about who we are and what we're capable of becoming, why didn't he teach it from the hillside, to everyone, all at once, the way he taught the parables? I think the answer is uncomfortable, but honest. Not everyone was ready to hold it. Some truths aren't hidden because someone wants to keep you small. They're hidden because they require you to already be standing somewhere solid before they can land without breaking you. You can't hand someone a blinding light before they've learned to sit still in a dim room first. Give a crowd something they aren't ready to carry, and they don't transform. They scatter, or worse, they twist it into something it was never meant to be. That's not exclusion. That's timing. And I think that distinction matters more than people realize, because we've been trained to hear chosen and think favorite, when really it might just mean ready. You've probably noticed something already, even if you couldn't name it. Every wisdom tradition on earth carries two versions of itself. There's the version for the crowd, the moral version, the be kind, be patient version, the one that fits neatly into a single sentence and a Sunday bulletin. And then there's a second version, quieter, slower to reveal itself, meant only for the ones who stay long enough to ask the harder questions once the easy answers stop satisfying them. Christianity carries this pattern openly. Origen, one of the most important theologians of the early church, someone who spent his entire life wrestling with scripture in ways most people never had access to, wrote plainly that there were hidden mysteries buried inside the text, meanings not meant for a surface reading, but for those willing to dig past the first layer and keep digging. And notice who was doing the digging in the Pistis Sophia. It wasn't the 12 alone, sitting quietly while Jesus lectured from the front of the room. It was Mary Magdalene again and again, asking question after question, pressing further than anyone else dared to press. In this text, she asks the overwhelming majority of every question recorded, far more than every other person in the room combined. That's not a small detail you can skip past. That tells you exactly what chosen actually meant here. Not status, not rank, not gender, hunger. Who kept leaning forward when everyone else had already leaned back, satisfied, content to stop at the first answer they were given. I'll be honest with you, this is the part that changed how I read the whole story. I used to think the chosen ones meant a fixed list, handpicked before the beginning of time, and the rest of us were simply watching from outside a locked door we'd never be given the key to. But the more I look at this text, the more I think the door was never locked at all. It just required you to keep asking after most people had already stopped asking, already gone home satisfied, already decided they'd heard enough. So here's my real opinion, and I'll say it plainly because I think it deserves to be said plainly. I think the church kept the first layer, the morals, the parables, the comfort, and buried the second layer, the transformation, the layer the Pistis Sophia preserved when almost nothing else did. Because morals keep a congregation gentle, predictable, easy to gather on a Sunday morning. Transformation makes people dangerous to control. And an institution built to last for centuries doesn't always survive people discovering they don't need the institution standing between them and the divine. Now let's talk about what this transformation actually was. Body of light is the phrase I'm using to frame it for you throughout this video, but the Pistis Sophia itself doesn't quite say it that way. When you read the actual description of that after-resurrection appearance, it doesn't call it a body of light. It calls it something stranger, something that hits differently once you actually hear it. A vesture of light. A vesture. A garment. Something worn. Sit with that word for a second, because it quietly changes the entire meaning of the scene. A garment isn't decoration. A garment is something you put on. Something you can grow into. Something that, according to this text, could be given to someone else standing beside you. The Pistis Sophia wasn't describing Jesus as uniquely lit from within, a one-time miracle no other human being could ever access. It was describing a state, a radiant, luminous condition of being, that could be worn by anyone who reached it through the right inner work. And this same idea shows up under a different name in Jewish mysticism. The Kabbalists called their vision of a luminous, structured, energetic body the merkaba, literally, the chariot, a vehicle of light the soul rides toward the divine. Two separate mystical lineages, describing what sounds like the same architecture of light wrapped around the human soul, using two different words for it. That's the part one find almost unbearably beautiful, honestly. This wasn't look at how special I am, and how far beneath me you'll always remain. This was closer to look at what's possible for you too, if you're willing to walk the road that gets you here. I don't think this was ever meant as poetry, and I don't think it was meant as a flattering metaphor either. I think it was meant as instruction, a demonstration, not a decoration hung on the story for effect. Here is the destination, he seems to be saying. Now let me show you the road that leads to it. And once you see it that way, an old, painfully familiar story from your childhood starts to look completely different. You've heard the story of the Transfiguration before. Jesus goes up a mountain with a few of his closest followers, and suddenly his face changes, his clothes turn impossibly bright, brighter than anything on this earth could ever bleach them. You've probably heard this filed under miracle. A strange, isolated event, dropped into the gospel to prove his divinity to a skeptical audience, and then quietly moved past on the way to the next chapter. I don't think that's the whole picture, and honestly, I never fully bought that reading even before I found this text. I think the Transfiguration is a preview, a demonstration of the exact same state the Pistis Sophia describes in far greater detail after the resurrection. He wasn't showing off on that mountain. He was showing his closest followers what the process leads to, so that when he later took Mary Magdalene and the others deeper into the actual teaching, they already carried a picture in their minds of where all of it was heading. I have to be honest with you about where I personally stand here, because I think a video like this deserves a real point of view instead of hedged, safe language pretending at neutrality. I believe the Transfiguration wasn't a magic trick performed once, admired, and never repeated. I believe it was a glimpse of an attainable state, given early and given deliberately, so the much harder inner work that came later would make sense to the people carrying it forward. Most sermons treat this story as something to admire from a comfortable distance, something that happened to him and not to us. I think it was meant to be walked toward. I think it was meant as an invitation disguised as an event. Here's a detail that almost never comes up in church, and once you hear it, you'll understand exactly why this text didn't survive the editing process that shaped the Bible you grew up with. The Pistis Sophia states that after the resurrection, Jesus didn't just appear a handful of times over 40 days and then vanish into the sky the way most of us were taught. It states he remained, teaching quietly, for 11 more years. 11 years. Let that number actually sit there for a second, because it completely reshapes the timeline you were handed as a child sitting in a pew. 40 days is a visit. 40 days is a farewell tour. 11 years is an entire hidden education, unfolding slowly, layer by layer, in rooms the wider world never got access to. I want to be direct with you about what this claim is and isn't. This comes from a Gnostic gospel, a text sitting outside the accepted biblical canon, written by an early Christian movement that believed salvation came through inner, hidden knowledge rather than institutional authority alone. It's not something the mainstream church treats as history, but whether you take it as literal history or as a preserved piece of a real oral teaching, it's a staggering claim to sit with. It means the resurrection wasn't the finish line of the story you were told. It was the opening of an entirely new chapter, one that almost nobody alive today has ever even heard the outline of. And in that chapter, the same small circle stays present, teaching after teaching. Mary Magdalene is still there. The disciples closest to him are still there. Not a public ministry anymore, not sermons to crowds on hillsides, a private one. Slower, deeper, layer after layer, for over a decade in the quiet. My honest take? If even part of this is close to what happened, it should make you genuinely frustrated that this got left out of what most of us were taught growing up. Not because someone wanted to protect you from confusion, and not because it was too dangerous for your soul to handle, but because an 11-year secret teaching doesn't fit neatly into a single Sunday morning service, and institutions tend to keep what fits and quietly set aside what doesn't. So why did it disappear? I want to walk carefully here, because I'm not interested in wild conspiracy talk, and I don't think this channel is served by pretending to know more than the evidence actually supports. I'm interested in what actually happened, as far as we can responsibly trace it through history. In the first few centuries after Jesus, there wasn't one single, agreed-upon Bible sitting neatly on a shelf waiting to be printed. There were dozens of texts circulating among different communities, and a long, complicated, very human process eventually decided which ones would become official scripture and which ones would quietly fall out of use, copied less and less until they disappeared from common memory entirely. The Pistis Sophia was one of the ones left behind in that long sorting. In 1945, a discovery in Egypt changed how much we understood about that entire period. A collection of ancient documents, now known as the Nag Hammadi Library, was found buried in sealed jars in the desert. Texts that had clearly been hidden on purpose, not simply lost by accident, almost certainly hidden to protect them from destruction during a time when owning the wrong text could be dangerous. This is the same current of thought Nag Hammadi confirmed existed, the same tradition that gave us the Pistis Sophia in the first place. Suddenly, historians had physical proof that an entire second current of early Christian thought had existed all along, one focused heavily on inner transformation, hidden knowledge, and light. Here's my honest opinion on why a teaching like the Body of Light wouldn't have survived that filtering process, and I'll say it as plainly as I can. An institution that grows into political power over centuries needs obedience far more than it needs awakened people wandering around, no longer needing the institution to reach the divine. A congregation that believes divinity lives far away, in heaven, accessed only through the proper channels and the proper leaders, is easy to organize, easy to gather, easy to keep in rows on a Sunday morning. A congregation that believes divinity can be activated inside their own body, through their own quiet inner work, without needing anyone standing permanently between them and it. That's a much harder thing to keep organized, and a much harder thing to control. I'm not saying anyone sat in a room centuries ago and plotted, line by line, to erase this teaching on purpose. I think it's simpler than that, and sadder too. Some teachings just don't survive an institution built for scale, order, and control. They get quietly filed under too strange, too mystical, not for the general public, and slowly, over generations, they vanish from the main story almost without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened. But they don't vanish from existence entirely. They go underground and they wait. Now let's get to the part you've been waiting for. Because knowing this teaching existed is one thing. Understanding what it actually asked of the person who received it is something else entirely. You've been patient this whole time, so let's not waste it. This is the moment in the Pistis Sophia where Jesus stops speaking in parables entirely. No more crowds, No more riddles wrapped in farming metaphors and stories about seeds. This is the point where he speaks plainly, directly, to Mary Magdalene, the one this text says could actually hold what he was about to say without breaking under the weight of it. And it's her question that opens the door, something close to, how does the soul come to wear this same light you carry? What follows isn't abstract philosophy dressed up in mystical language. It's a sequence, a practice given step by step. I want to walk you through it the way it's been passed down and carefully reconstructed, not word for word as scripture, because I won't pretend to hand you a manufactured quote that isn't genuinely there in the text, but shaped the way this teaching was shaped, in the same spirit, the same slow, deliberate rhythm, step by step. So let's actually do this together, right now, in your own body, as you're listening to my voice. First, stillness. Before anything else, he has her settle the body completely. No performing, no posturing, nothing to prove to anyone in the room. Just quiet. Feet grounded if you're sitting, hands open and resting in your lap. The teaching insists that nothing real can happen inside you while your body is still busy trying to look a certain way. Second, the breath as a threshold. Slow inhale for counts. A brief, gentle hold. A longer exhale, 6 counts. Breath here isn't just air moving in and out of the lungs. It's treated as a doorway, the hinge point between the self you show the world every single day and the self made of light quietly underneath it. Third, attention on the inner light. Eyes closed. Attention drawn first to the center of your chest, then gently lifted to a soft point just behind your eyes. You're not straining to imagine anything vivid or forced. You're simply noticing the way turning a dial slowly brings a signal that was always broadcasting suddenly into focus. Fourth, the silent word. An inward phrase held quietly, never spoken aloud, never performed for anyone. Something in the spirit of, I am light, wearing flesh for a while. Not a chant, not a spell, nothing magical about the words themselves. A focusing tool, repeated silently, the way an anchor keeps a small boat from drifting out on open water. Fifth, surrender, not effort. This is the hardest one, and I want to be completely honest with you about it. Most people quit right here, at exactly this step. They want a lightning bolt. They want fireworks, an instant transformation, something dramatic enough to post about the same afternoon. But the teaching asks for the opposite of straining. It asks you to stop trying to force the light forward, and instead let it rise on its own, the quiet, patient way heat rises without ever needing to be pushed. Sixth, closing the circle. Slowly bring your attention back into the room around you. 3 full breaths. Eyes open. This was never framed in this teaching as a one-time event you complete and check off. It was practiced again and again, daily, until what once felt foreign started to feel familiar, until it stopped being a technique you performed and simply became how you moved through your day. I'm not going to tell you this changes your entire life in one single sitting, because that would be dishonest, and dishonesty isn't what this channel exists for. What I will tell you plainly is this is the door the Pistis Sophia points toward. Most people never even knew a door like this existed. Now you do. What he gave her then, quietly, in a room most of history quietly forgot about, I'm handing to you now, all these centuries later. Here's the thing I want you to really understand before we finish today. This teaching Jesus gave was never actually lost, no matter how it might feel from where you're sitting. It went underground instead. It slipped into the language of mystics who kept describing inner light, long after the official institutions had stopped teaching what Jesus once taught directly to anyone. It slipped into art, into paintings of saints crowned in gold light, into stained glass windows glowing at just the right hour of a quiet afternoon, into every depiction of holiness surrounded by radiance instead of shadow. Somebody somewhere, in every single generation since, kept the memory alive without always even having the words to explain why it mattered so much to them. And if I'm honest with you, I think you've felt a flicker of this yourself, at some point in your own life, even if you never called it by this name. That quiet, unexplainable moment of stillness where you felt lit up from the inside, briefly, before life pulled you back into the noise and the schedule and the noise again. That wasn't random. I genuinely think that was the same current, still running underneath everything, patiently waiting for someone to hand you the map back to it. That's what this teaching was always meant to be at its core. Not a secret kept from you out of cruelty, not a locked door built to keep you out forever. A door, simply waiting for you to be ready enough to walk through it. The same door Jesus once opened for the one person willing to keep asking. So here's where I'll leave you today. You came into this video thinking you were about to learn a strange piece of forgotten history about Jesus. And you did. But I think what actually happened, underneath all of it, is something closer to a mirror being quietly held up in front of you. The chosen ones weren't chosen because of bloodline, or rank, or luck, or some arbitrary decision made before the beginning of time. They were chosen because they stayed in the room and kept asking the harder question long after everyone else had already left, satisfied with the easy answer they'd been given. Jesus didn't hand the body of light teaching to the loudest voice in the crowd. He handed it to the one who refused to stop asking. So let me ask you the same question this entire video has been circling quietly from the very first sentence. Are you willing to keep asking, even after the comfortable answers run out? If this stirred something in you, stay close. There's more of this hidden layer to walk through, and I'm nowhere near done pulling back the curtain on it. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper with me. Drop a comment telling me exactly where you felt this land the hardest. And I'll see you in the next one, where we go even further into everything Jesus taught that got quietly left out.